Welcome to this very special edition of The Author's Voice with KAJ, a show where we explore the stories behind the stories. Here we dive into the worlds created by authors, discover their inspirations, and ensure that you walk away enriched and inspired. And today we have with us author Kristin Louise Duncombe. She is her books chronicle the journey of an American woman who gave up everything for love. She is a coach, she is a therapist, and she specializes in working with complex trauma, depression, and anxiety based in Paris, France. And today we'll be talking about her book, Object, a Memoir of Childhood Abuse, and a shocking cover up at the highest ranks of government. Welcome to the show, Kristin.
Thank you so much for having me, AJ. It's great to see you again. I always enjoy talking to you.
Same here, Kristin. Welcome once again to the KAJ Masterclass Author Voice with KAJ. So we'll talk about your book in detail on this particular platform. But before that, let's understand, because it will be talking about your journey more as an author. We'll talk about first, how did you start with your journey as an author? Means how did this book actually start happening? Was it an accident, or was it a planned thing to get into writing?
Well, so I should clarify that the book was definitely not an accident. The book was a long time coming, but this is my third book. So I think the real way to answer the question is to tell you what kicked me off on the writing journey of my first book. And that is, I think this is something that most listeners will find very interesting. I had always wanted to be a writer. When I was a kid, it was what I dreamed of. I was an avid reader. I used to devour books. I was like a bookish child, and I dreamed of writing my own books. But as a very disorganized person, a scattered person, I never quite figured out how to put pen to paper. But what happened to me is I had a mortality check when I was in my mid-30s. I was suddenly diagnosed with skin cancer. You might be able to see I've got this big scar on the side of my face. For those of you that know about skin cancer, I had the worst one, melanoma. Fortunately, it was caught early, but still, it was a real reckoning with the fear of death. I had both of my children who are now in their 20s. They were babies at the time. I had a 1-year-old and a 7-year-old, and I was terrified that I was not going to live to see them grow up. And the thing that came alongside that was this terror that not only would I die before they had grown up, but that I would die without ever having written the book I had been writing in my head for many years. And that book wasn't the one that we're going to talk about today. That book, my first book, is Trailing, and I'm not going to go into the details about it, but when you introduced me, you said that I'm an author that writes about being a woman that gave up everything for love. That's what that book is about. My very first book also deals with the mortality crisis, because instead of pursuing my own career, I gave up my career to become a trailing spouse, and I followed my husband off to the front lines of disaster and disease in East Africa. And we had a near-death experience there as well. We were carjacked by armed gunmen who tried to kidnap us. And for many years, I had been thinking, I have got to tell this story. But like I said, I was just a disorganized person, plus having small children, having my career as a therapist, I didn't get around to it. So that's a very long-winded way of saying that the thing that led me into finally writing was the fear that I was going to die. And when I feared the skin cancer attack, that is when I finally got serious, and I wrote my first book. And after I did that, for anyone who's listening, who's also done any kind of writing, I think this will probably resonate. Once you do it and you sort of understand the process of writing, that you understand that when you write a book, at first it's messy, it doesn't make any sense, it's a terrible, some people call it the shitty first draft. But you get that down, and then you beautify that draft, and then you beautify the next draft. And then once I understood that, oh, that's how you write a book, my next two books were easier to write, even though writing a book is never easy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Writing a book is never that easy. And that is where, we'll talk about your book, your latest book, Object a Memoir. Yes. Tell us about this book. How did this book come along? Means nobody wants, I don't think anyone plans for such a book, but it just happens and it's about that. Help us understand what this book is all about.
Well, so this book, so I'm a memoirist. Let me just clarify that. And what I like to do, my writing style is I like to tell true stories from my own life, but I like to tell them in such a way that other people grappling with similar problems can understand how I reached the other side of the problem. And so what this book is about, and I think this is going to be disturbing for many people to hear, but I know that I'm not alone, which is why I wrote the book. This book is about my experience being sexually abused as a child by a high-profile U.S. diplomat that was then protected by the U.S. government. So when I was growing up, my father was in the U.S. Foreign Service, and unfortunately, my dad died almost 4 years ago, so he has not been around to hear me talk about this book, but this was a story that traumatized my entire family and a whole community of people, because when my family was posted at the U.S. Embassy mission in the Ivory Coast in West Africa, one of the senior diplomats at post was also a serial pedophile. And he sexually abused many of us girls between the ages of 6 and 12 repeatedly over the course of 2 years. And when it was found out, he was taken back to Washington, D.C. almost overnight. And then the U.S. government protected him. They did not prosecute him, and they did not even fire him. And he was allowed to carry on with impunity. And for another 20 years, he continued raping and abusing young girls until finally he was stopped. And I wrote this book. Some of you may be familiar with this case. I mean, there's so many cases like this in the media all the time. And I know that India has also been grappling with all the crises of rape and sexual abuse. But the thing that really made me write this book was after Donald Trump was elected in the first presidency. And there was all of that buzz about, how he, and by the way, sorry, everyone, I was telling AJ, I'm in Paris and it is so hot today. It's 33 degrees and I'm sweating. So excuse me for wiping my brow. Donald Trump had just been elected president in spite of those tapes being released of him talking about grabbing women by the pussy. I'm sorry to even say that online, but I think that made headlines the world over. His vulgar locker room talk. Then Brett Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court justice, was confirmed in spite of the allegations of rape. But then the main thing that really tipped the balance for me, some of you might remember, is in 2016, there was a big scandal that had to do with the U.S. gymnastics team, the Olympic team, girls and young women's gymnastics. The team doctor, Larry Nassar, had sexually abused like 200 of the athletes that came through the doors of that institution. And like in the case of what happened to me and my community when I was a kid, he had been reported. But the institution he worked for, which was the University of Michigan, they protected him. So he was allowed, in spite of the known facts that he was a serial pedophile and abuser, he was allowed to continue having access to girls. And when that story came out, I was so angry about it that is what mobilized me to finally write my book about that story that I had been keeping secret for so long.
Absolutely, absolutely, Christian. So I want to understand, this is not an easy book to write. People write their memoirs and they hope to write about so many good things and difficult things. This is a different sort of a story, and it takes a good amount of time to get space and your mind also. Help us understand your writing process. In mean, this is something. Was it very difficult? Was it painful? Was it, almost like working like an activist in terms of, sending your message to the world through, and your memoir, it looks like to be less of your memoir but more about others also, because it's also the message for the world. Help us understand this whole process about, writing this story.
Well, in all honesty, when I sat down and started writing, and I started writing in August of 2020. So it took me about 4 years, stopping and starting to write the book, or maybe 3.5 years, because the book came out in August of 2024. Oftentimes people think, oh, if you're writing about being abused and all of that it must have been like this wrenching experience where it was traumatic to write it. But honestly, that wasn't really the case for me, because I didn't have what you would call repressed memory syndrome, nothing like that. I had always known what had happened to me. And there's multiple parts to the story, because, the abuse came to an end when it started when I was 10. It came to an end when I was 12. When I was 22, the U.S. State Department wrote me a check for $20,000 to pay for therapy, because they acknowledged what had happened, but they made me sign on the dotted line that I would take the check and then not bother them any longer. And then 10 years later, the pedophile, his name was Mr. Mulcahy, he was arrested for raping an 8-year-old girl. So when I was in my mid-30s, I finally got a chance. There was a statute of limitations, so I wasn't able to testify in court, but I was able to submit a deposition that contributed to getting him locked up finally. So the point is, for all these years, I had been managing the impact of the story in my own life. So when I finally sat down to write it, it was more like putting the pieces of a puzzle together. Because what I needed to do, and again, anyone that writes knows that you've got to find a way to make a story coherent. So what I had to do was sort of reflect on everything that had happened to me and how the events that had taken place impacted my life as an adult, and then find a way to piece the story together so that it could make sense for the reader. And something I'm very proud of about this book is that I write the book in a dual timeline, and the chapters alternate. They go from a childhood chapter, childhood starting at age 10, but then leading up to when I'm 22. So child through teenagehood. And I think I might have mentioned this to you before. For 2 years when I was a teenager, I lived in New Delhi. So there's a chapter of the book that takes place in India. But then the contemporary thread that is interlaced has to do with my life as a 40-something-year-old woman who has just left her marriage and is making sense of how the abuse as a child affected not only my whole adult life, but affected who I ended up marrying, and some of the dynamics that took place in my marriage that were not healthy dynamics. I always like to be careful. My intention is never to badmouth my ex-husband. We still have a good friendship, and it's someone that I admire and support and care about. But we should not have gotten married, because there was some fundamental differences between us. And this is one of the things that I write about in the book. One of the legacies of the abuse on my psychology is I became the master the queen of being able to push my feelings down and to adapt to keep the other person happy. That's called fawning. I was a master fawner, which is why I ended up marrying someone that I had these fundamental differences with, because he made it very clear who he was and what our life was going to be like if we got married. And because I was so terrified of losing him, I said, okay, yeah, that's fine. So it's not that he tricked me into anything. I tricked myself into things. And that's the main psychological legacy that I have had to unlearn as an adult now in what I consider to be my post-traumatic years. Yeah.
Absolutely, Kristin. So, talking of traumatic years, you talk about complex trauma.
Yes.
And also about how this abuse has ripple effects that, for many years. You are a therapist also. So I want to understand, how should people understand this thing called complex trauma, and understanding from your story or any other experience that they have in their own lives?
Yes, it's a great question. And it's so important because, many people, I think, suffer from complex trauma, but because it is less well known than acute trauma, many people don't recognize that that is their problem. And I'm a great example of that. I mean, I went on to become a therapist, but I didn't even realize that what my problem is this thing called complex trauma. Another way to say complex trauma is developmental trauma. So I'll explain by giving an example. If there's a bomb blast and you're, a victim of a bomb blast and you survive, you are going to have what is called acute trauma. That has to do with being, everything's going along normally, and then something happens that overwhelms you sensorially in a moment and will trigger the reactions that most people have heard of when they talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. It's fight, flight, or freeze. Those are the three things that when we are facing acute trauma, one or both of those things will happen: fight, flight, or freeze. In complex trauma or developmental trauma, what we're really talking about is a quieter type of infraction that affects the person's psychological development. So, for example, in the case of what I went through that I describe in my book, this person that abused me for 2 years, he wasn't like, if you saw him, you wouldn't think, oh, what a monster. He was the quintessential pedophile. He was the jolly, grandfatherly type that was always playing with the kids, always joking around, always buying everyone ice cream cones, coming up with the candy, the presents. Everyone loved him, and I loved him too. So complex trauma, and this is, I think it's a great example of it, has to do with the fact that when you're a kid and an adult that you love and trust starts doing something inappropriate or scary to you, you don't have the emotional resources to fight back. I mean, okay, this was the late 70s, early 80s, and I think children are better educated now. When I was a kid, no one talked about what to do if someone tries to touch your private parts, etc. So when he would do that to me, I would just freeze and let him do what he was going to do. And then when he would, tell me that I had to be quiet about it, then I would go back afterwards into just playful mode, trying to keep him happy, because there was a part of me that was afraid. There was a part of me that knew something was wrong, but there was also a part of me that thought, well, he's Mr. Mulcahy. He's so wonderful and everyone loves him, so the problem must be me. And so imagine being a 10 or 11-year-old child going through that. What that does to your psychology is it breaks down your self-image. And the breakdown of self-image and the way you develop coping mechanisms around that, that is what becomes complex trauma. That's the
Absolutely.
developmental wound. I don't know if that's a useful explanation. I think so.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Kristin. Now, in terms of your book, who is this book for that you have written? And when you talk of the, title of the book, Object,
Yes.
a memoir, what does this object mean? It can mean several things at the same. I want to understand your understanding.
Yes, well, it's so interesting. I'm going to tell you what the title means, but then I'm also going to tell you how some people have interpreted the title, which I think is really, really interesting. It's like a play on words that I didn't intend. But the reason I call the book Object is because one of the things that I write about is how the way the abuse affected me psychologically, and the fact that the US government protected the abuser and not the girls. I developed a complex where I moved into adolescence and adulthood believing that my only value in the world came from being an object of desire for men. And because I had developed this fawning complex, and again, fawning means when you act compliant and agreeable, even if it's not what you want, because that is what you have learned to do in order to maintain relational safety. I was functioning as an object moving through the world, being chosen by men as opposed to me choosing who I wanted to spend time with. And so I like to make the distinction about being an object versus the subject of my own life. And the difference really between being an object and being the subject is if you are functioning as an object, you are really concerned with appearances, not just physical appearances, but appearances, as I was saying, like, am I coming off as nice? Am I coming off as agreeable? Am I coming off as compliant? Am I keeping the peace here so that I don't have to deal with anyone's anger? That's being an object. When you're being a subject, what leads you and guides you is your own feelings about a situation. It's not how do I appear, it's how do I feel about this situation in front of me? How do I feel about this person that I'm interacting with? How do I feel about this man who is choosing me? And allowing your feelings to be the compass. So I called the book Object because for me, the book is about undoing this lifelong trauma of believing that I am nothing more than an object. But the interesting play on words that some people brought to my attention is some people thought that I wrote the book to say, I object to objectification. And it's so interesting because it does work. It was not my intention, but it does work. So I find that a clever little, it's like a little bonus title.
That's very intelligent.
Yeah. And it's not me that thought of it, but I'm glad that it turned out that way. Yeah.
Absolutely. Kristin. So for a lot of people, who would be reading this book, what is it that you want your readers, what insights, what messages you want them to take away from this particular book? And who is this book for?
That's such a great question. And thank you for asking, because I love to answer that question. So this book is really, it's for everyone, but more specifically in the category of everyone. I want anyone who has been the victim of abuse or has complex trauma to read this book, because I believe the book really provides a roadmap out of objectification and into becoming the subject of your own life. So obviously, sometimes men are victims as well, but most victims of abuse are women. So this book is mostly for women, and I even dedicate the book to women and girls everywhere. Now, the book is also for men, because I know that there are lots of good guys out there, many, 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 but I think that men, the good ones, need to also have a book that helps them understand what happens to girls and women. Because even though I'm saying there's lots of good guys out there, the way I feel that even the good guys are failing the women is that there's some bad guys out there, the ones that abuse and rape. The good guys that don't do that, they need to be playing a much heavier role in standing up to their fellow men and going, what the hell are you doing? Stop. You know, like, to take it back, for example, because, you know, I read the stories from all the different countries about all the different types of abuse. And when there's those high profile cases that come from India, for example, of like a girl that will be gang raped on a bus, for example, I am convinced that amongst the men on the bus, there must have been at least several of them that were not okay with what was happening, but they were too afraid to say, stop, we are not doing this. So they go, you know, it's like that crowd mentality. And I think that if men could learn to stand up to other men and be more allies with women and girls, I think that already we could change rape culture. And so I hope that men read this book to also feel empowered to be better advocates for women.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in that particular case that you talked about, the good part is that action was taken. You know, several of those people, it was an empty bus that they used, and after work hours, and several of those culprits, they were, you know, they were hanged later on. They had to bear. But yes, in many other cases, men are there and they have to stand up, and that is where your title of the book, I object. You object to what is not correct, and this will stop the abuse that is happening everywhere, in every part of our society.
Hopefully, yes, indeed. Indeed, yes.
Absolutely. There's so much to learn about all this from you, you know, Kristin, and I'm sure not only your story, the work that you do, and I'm sure a lot of people would want to understand your story better through your book, also through the work you do, also about complex trauma that they would want to connect with you. What is the best way for them to do so, Kristin?
The best way to find me is to just go online, Google my name. You'll quickly come to my website. It's KristinDuncombe.com. And there you can find out everything about my work, my books, how to reach me. My email address is there. And I love hearing from listeners and readers. So if anyone wants to get in touch, I would be most happy to. You can also find me on LinkedIn, Instagram. You know how it is in today's modern world. It's so easy to find people. So just Google me and you'll find multiple ways.
Absolutely. Absolutely. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of The Author's Voice with KAJ. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.